when I bring up a title slide that I've got a crane, the symbol of your conference here, but it's a crane with a reflection. And I have that because I'm going to ask you or invite you over the next 20, 30, 40 minutes to reflect on whether what I'm saying bears some relevance to your organization, your life, your jobs. And as I was thinking about putting this talk together, one of the things that sort of got in my gut more and more and more was the title of this event, Shift Happened, Transformation Required. And when I reflect on my client experiences, what I have the sense of is that clients have not kept up. So this is really about catching up. This is about organizations catching up with the shifts that have already occurred. Right about the time that I was starting to put this together, there was this much ballyhooed, much publicized thing that came out of Silicon Valley and Marissa Mayer and Yahoo, and she said, no more work at home. And a very interesting statement came leaked from an HR memo that said, we all have to be one Yahoo, so we've all got to be in one place. And she said something even more interesting in an interview on April 19th. She said, people may be more productive at home, but they are more creative and more collaborative when they are face-to-face. I was astounded. I was absolutely astounded because that's kind of how that looked to me. Trying to take the genie and put it back in the bottle. Take that smoke and put it all back in. Because while she could ask the people in Silicon Valley to come out of their homes and go back to the workplace, what she couldn't do is control something that looked like this. And this is how all of our work environment, work ecosystem now looks. We have collaborators and partners who not only are not in our geography, they're not even in our company anymore. And so to all of a sudden say we can collaborate only when we're face-to-face effectively is missing the mark. So what I want to go through with you over the next few minutes are 5 trends and the human response to them. I don't think those are the only 5 that are out there. You've heard of a lot of others. I think these are 5 that have a human attribute to them that we can design around and organize around and make sense of. The 5 that I want to talk about are globalization, virtualizations, networks, and transients. Externalities or externalization was a word that got used yesterday. Speed, data decentralization or dispersal, and with it, the democratization of decision-making, and lastly, innovation. We are all now globalization. We are all globalized, whether or not we like it. There are still a lot of people out there who are resisting. We are all there, though. This is off of your internet, a map of your locations. Your superannuation and wealth management areas may not be so globalized yet. Your capital investment is. And something that most people don't think about, your supplier base is. You're dealing with suppliers that are global all the time. So what are the implications of that when we are building an organization? What are the implications of that for ourselves personally? And when I reflect, if there's one message that I'd like to leave you with about globalization and working across cultural boundaries, which I do every day as part of an Indian company with 150,000 people in India, and I don't look like them. I live these things, and what it comes through to me as the overarching message is we are not all alike. We are profoundly different. And you cannot paint with a broad brush that takes, for me, my American perspective, or you, your Australian perspective, and attempts to paint with that brush across the entire world. Craig Dunn, in his opening talk yesterday, said, stay open to the differences. That, in my mind, is the secret sauce that we have to build into our organization. And let me share with you a few anecdotes about that. There was a C-level delegation of a major Infosys client who came to visit us and our campus in Bangalore, India. And these campuses that we have are gorgeous. They're like big university campuses, manicured lawns, absolutely beautiful. And this executive was walking around with his Infosys hosts for the day, and what he kept seeing was these ladies in saris on their hands and knees cutting the grass with shears. And he stood it for as long as he could stand it, and about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he turns to his Infosys host, a very senior executive, and says, you know, they have lawnmowers that could do this a lot more efficiently. Now, do you really think that the Infosys senior executive didn't know there were lawnmowers? I mean, really? And the guy kind of kept his composure, the Infosys executive, and he says, yes, that's true. But if I did it that way, I would have to unemploy all these people who are the sole support of their families. So when you think about dealing cross-border and dealing cross-culturally, you need to realize that people have different agendas. You may be concerned about efficiency, low cost, operational excellence, and the person you're dealing with may be concerned about full local employment. Very important to keep these things in mind. Here's another example for you. There's a wonderful book out there called Speaking of India by Craig Storty, and he makes the point that the communication styles naturally between India and the West, and in particularly the US, are about as far apart as you can possibly get on any sort of scale. And he says if you take the communication styles of someone who's raised in India from least direct to most direct, and you match that up, say, with someone from America, it matches about like this. That the most direct you're likely to get from an Indian colleague is barely on the radar screen if you're an American. How does that play out? We do a lot of outsourcing work. And I've learned that I need to do a lot of acculturation for my clients because the experience they have is they say, I need this project or I need this deliverable by Friday. Now, if you're talking to an American, European, probably an Australian, what you hear is, if it can't be done, sorry, not going to happen. Or at least very politely, I really don't think I can do that. Can we have till Monday? What you often hear, and what they often hear from the people who are providing service from India is, that's extremely difficult, but I'll try. Now, the Indian person thinks that they have just said no. The Westerner has just heard yes. And so when we get to Friday and the project isn't done, all of a sudden everybody says, what happened? Where did we miss the point? And we missed the point by not realizing that people are different and we hear and we speak with different filters all the time. One final example of that. Years ago, I sat on a task force about corporate communication. It was for a global organization, but this was some years back, which was the start of globalization. And we were designing communication for the company. And we had basically a pretty Western, pretty white group of people, except for one international fellow, a Norwegian. And we get to the end of our piece of work where we've designed this big communication thing, and we turn to him and say, Terje, how do you think this will play in the rest of the world? And there's this sort of stunned, gobsmacked silence, and he organizes himself and he says, I'm a Norwegian. How am I supposed to know how this plays in Egypt? I don't know. And that was a real aha moment for me years ago, and it's something that I think a lot of us fall into, where we tend to think of ourselves and the other. And we don't differentiate within the other. We paint with that broad brush. So what's the single most important thing you can do, in my mind, to help you and your organizations deal with globalization? It is to develop cultural agility, which is not about sitting through long training classes of what do people in Japan think and how do they operate. It's about maintaining that curiosity, that openness to the difference. And so every day you enter into the situation as if it is new, and you are observant and curious and astutely aware. Second major thing I wanted to talk about was networking. Virtualization, we're no longer sitting in the same building. We're no longer sitting even in the same country, and half the people I collaborate with are no longer in my company. There are two things in my mind I want to leave you with about that I think are crucial, absolutely crucial on a daily basis. And one is, as I said at the breakfast panel I did yesterday, this is where I feel I ought to put on kind of my T-Rex suit because I'm feeling like a dinosaur here with what I'm about to say. Communication in the most basic sense. And when I think about 15, 20 years ago, there wasn't an organization out there that didn't have interpersonal communication training skills, listening, talking, speaking, writing, and then meeting skills. There wasn't an organization out there that didn't have that on the agenda 15 to 20 years ago. I haven't walked into an organization in the past 5 years that has that as a major part of their development agenda. Lots and lots of technology training. Very little training on how we really talk to each other. And when you're down to 140 characters, you had better be clear. You had better be clear. And we're no longer teaching people to do that, and we're no longer teaching people the skills of listening, because when you think about how do you work in that virtualized environment, one of two things that underpins it all is the ability to talk effectively to your business partners, to your employees in other places, to your customers in other places, and be absolutely crystal clear in both directions on expectations, on definition of success, on metrics. Put communication back on the agenda. Put it back on the agenda. It is vital. The fact that we've given people devices does not mean we communicate more effectively. The second thing, and this is more for those of you who are leaders designing organizations, think about the human architecture and the whole system you're putting in place to support that. And that, in my mind, is where Yahoo fell down. Marissa Mayer could not envision an alternative to having people in one place. And so she said, pull them back in. I'm going to reel them in. There are alternatives, but you have to design them. And the one that is probably the most important to get right is a scheme or a method for setting objectives, managing performance, measuring performance, and creating rewards, incentives and disincentives, be they small or large. Psychologists will tell us that 80% of behavior is driven by consequences, so you can't ignore that piece of it. And if you look at good contracts that are in place, particularly around things with formalized networked relationships, external relationships, outsourcing, they invest quite heavily in putting in place service level agreements that formalize those understandings. When you are dealing with collaborators in your own organization, you can go through the same thing and accomplish the same if you design carefully around objective setting, performance management, metrics, rewards, and consequences. I want to talk about speed. A lot of conversation about that. Everything's fast, business is fast, change is fast, and in fact, change is so fast, there's not an organization I've walked into, probably in the last 7 or 8 years, that didn't have 6 initiatives last year, 8 this year, 7 next year, 5 stacked up after that, and they're already on the books. They're already on the books. And then you talk to employees in these organizations, and they're going, oh my God, when is it going to be over? When are we going to get back to normal? And when I hear that, I think the leadership of those organizations has done their workforce a tremendous disservice by not being honest and by not saying this is the new normal. It is not over, because this year rolls into next year, rolls into the next one, rolls into the next one. This is how it is. And it's how it's going to be. And then puts lots of things in place to help that organization adapt. If you're really lucky, you're in an organization that has both the ability and the wherewithal to take a break, take a pause, allow people to absorb before going on. Not always possible. What can you do? You can start selecting for agility and change resilience in your recruiting and, more importantly, in your leadership selection. You can support your people with robust change management programs. You can find ways to give people a measured break, and one of the most important things you can do is integrate all that change that's happening that, if you're at the top of the house, probably looks organized to you because you know how it all comes together. The people on the front lines don't. And they see this and this and this and this. Do the work for them. Don't expect them to integrate it. Integrate it yourself. And if you're on the front lines, if you're an individual on the front lines, speak up and ask. If you don't see how it goes together, please ask and find out, because that will actually help you deal with it. One of the byproducts and probably causative factors of all this speed is the proliferation and dispersal of data, democratization, if you will. That has profound impact on structure and on decision making. And when I think about what's the fundamental kind of root impact of all that, it's that this doesn't work anymore. This really doesn't work anymore. Which is not to say that there aren't boardrooms or there aren't executive council rooms and that some decisions don't go through there, but they don't all go through there. And you have to develop the organizational savvy, top to bottom, to know what belongs there and what belongs at the coalface, as they say, where the data is, where the critical insights are. And when I thought about what's the shift we have to make, two things really come to my mind around that, and they both operate in many, many organizations. The first is there is a paradigm which says, if I'm at the top of the house, by definition, I am smarter and more insightful than everyone else. That's out there, and it's operating, whether people say it or not. And I know this, I feel this firsthand. I'm my own best guinea pig for these things. I'm running a practice, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I have someone who just joined, who's virtually half my age, who comes to me and says, but what about, or I think, and there's this kind of riling up of bile inside me, and I kind of have to push that down before I respond and say, wait a minute, I don't know everything. If this person is talking about social media, if this person is talking about Gen Y attitudes, if this person is talking about what's happening on his or her client right now, I've got to quit trying to be the smart one and start trying to be the interested one who's listening. The flip side of that is also true. Individuals, whatever level you're at, we have taken on that cultural paradigm, and the result of it is we think if we have a good idea, they're not going to listen. I'm not even going to try after a point. And if I've tried twice before and haven't been able to get anyone's attention, I'm just done. I'm not going to volunteer. I don't have the power to make the decision. I don't have the authority, and nobody wants to hear from me because I'm just whatever that just is. I want to tell you a story. It's an old story. It's a story from about 30 years ago, but there is no better story to illustrate the operation of those two paradigms than what I'm about to talk about. Air Florida Flight 90 in 1982 was a flight out of Washington, D.C., somewhere down the East Coast. And the scenario behind this was worst winter storm on the East Coast of the U.S. in decades, literally. Planes stacked up for hours, nobody going anywhere. Everybody's frustrated. Everybody's on the plane. The pilot wants to get home, the co-pilot wants to get home. They're all sitting there. They finally get the signal. They back out of the gate, get in line to be de-iced, get de-iced, and they pull out into position on the runway. And there they wait. And they wait, and they wait, and they wait. And as they're sitting there, the co-pilot, who's a young guy, says, Larry, to the pilot, very senior guy, Larry, looks like there's a little bit of ice up on his top up there. Larry's more interested in correcting him than he is in hearing, and he says, side. It's on the side. Co-pilot's watching, and he says, Larry, there's some icicles up there. And of course, what he's thinking is, if it's on that guy's wings, who pulled out right in front of us, it's probably on ours, too. Larry doesn't respond. So he tries one more time, and he says, well, maybe we should circle back around. No response. Larry's thinking martini, he's thinking his wife, he's thinking beach in Florida, whatever he's thinking. No response. Time to go, and he finally says, we get to go now. And they start the run down the runway. Co-pilot's still watching the gauges, and he says, this isn't right, Larry. This isn't right. Larry says, 80. Co-pilot's still looking at it, and he says, Larry, it's really not right here. Larry says, 120, we're going. 37 seconds of silence. And the next and the last thing you hear on the black box is the co-pilot saying, Larry, we're going down, Larry. And Larry finally hears him and says, I know. After that event, and this is a gritty, grainy news picture from 30 years ago, 71 of 75 people on the plane killed and 4 civilians as the plane slammed into a bridge over the Potomac. One of the things that came out, the aviation industry did a lot of investigation on this, and that was one of the major incidents that was behind what ultimately became known as cockpit coordination training, which taught 2 things. It taught senior people that they absolutely had to listen to the people below them because those people might have the best information. And it taught the junior people that they absolutely had to speak up. That was 30 years ago. Not that much has changed. There are major disasters, be they tangible or intangible, in industry happening today where the data and the insights were there. Out at the coal seam, somebody knew. When you unravel these disasters, whether it's a financial disaster, whether it's a physical disaster, something blows up, almost inevitably, somebody knew. Leaders, learn to be a little more humble, choke down that bile, realize that the critical information and insight might be out there at the coalface, and what structure can you put in place and what culture can you put in place to allow that to surface and be acted on in a way that at the bad end of the scale saves you from disaster, and at the good end of the scale causes a disruption and takes you to the front of the pack. Last thing I wanted to talk about was innovation. I have a lot of clients, I go in, might already be working there, and the client says, we'd really like to build an innovation culture. Here's a secret. What I've learned is that is secret code for I want to put in SharePoint or some other collaboration platform. And the logic train kind of goes like this. If I put in the technology, people will collaborate, and if they collaborate, they'll innovate, and if they innovate, I get new stuff to market. Wow. That is a pretty serious ladder of inference that people go up. And when it doesn't work, and when they come back to me and they say, what do I need to do here? My answer is remove the barriers. Because you've got all this wonderful creativity out there. The light bulbs are going on in the people you have right now. It's all out there. Remove the barriers because it's running into a brick wall. What do I mean by that? Most organizations still reward people for individually being smart, not collectively being smart. Most organizations still reward people for individual accomplishment, not collective accomplishment. In my own organization, if I take someone else with me to a sale, even if they're the best qualified person to speak to it, my share of the pie goes down. What do you think that encourages me to do? We all have those sorts of barriers. And if we get beyond that, then what I see a lot of companies, and particularly Silicon Valley companies, falling into, all the reward is on ideation, not on incubation, not on getting it to market. It's the next big thing. And I was working for a household name technology company, who shall remain nameless, and went into their office. We were doing a big project, and it just was like moving molasses uphill, incredibly slow. And I finally started asking around, what's really going on here? And I had not one, but handfuls of managers in that company going, well, you know what it is? You don't get any reward for finishing anything around here. You get a reward for the next big thing. So we're all trying to get out. We're all trying to go somewhere else. So think about what are the barriers in your organization to the innovation that may naturally be bubbling up there. Turn around and ask the employees who you're asking to innovate, what's stopping you? Why aren't we doing more of this? And then you can do all kinds of wonderful positive things. There's an organization I know that kind of has internal VC funding for people. If you have, from the top of the house to the newest employee, an idea that you want funded about a new product, you can go before this committee and get funded. I mean, those are really, really cool things. But those will not work if you don't remove the brick walls. So ask people, what's stopping you? Think about it, reflect on it. What's stopping you? What I want to leave you with is this model. This isn't by any means the only model out there for organizational thinking and systemic design. It's one I like for a very simple reason. If you kind of imagine the points of that star all hung together by rubber bands so that it's kind of elastic, right? If you imagine that, what we have a tendency to do is work in one of the areas on that star without thinking about the other. We slam in a new technology system, so we stretch out the technology point, don't exert any tension on the other, and the whole thing gets out of alignment. Here's a favorite, restructuring. If the corporation isn't performing well, we must reorganize. That's a big one. Stretch out the structure point, don't redo anything else. What you have to do, my contention is think systemically and design the human system or the human architecture with the same incisiveness, engineering clarity, hard work that you design anything else. How much do you invest in your IT architecture? How much do you invest in your human architecture? Think about it. And I think that, in my mind, is the secret to taking all the innovation, all the technology that's out there, all the market changes that are going out there, and make them work in your organization. What are the skills and competencies you need? How do you organize those into jobs? How do you organize jobs into organizational structures and delegations of authority and decision-making processes? What processes do you have for setting objectives, managing performance, measuring performance, rewarding, compensating, and what are you doing in a conscious way to impact the culture that either creates a fertile environment or that brick wall? Thank you for your time.